This is Deborah Bingham. Welcome to the Institute for Perinatal Quality Improvement webinar, Champions webinar. I want to make sure that people can hear me okay, so just if you could give me like some kind of thumbs up if you're able to hear. And if not, just put it in chat if you have any questions, if you're unable to hear, and we'll get back to you. So I'm going to start out the webinar by introducing the Institute for Perinatal Quality Improvement and explain a little bit about why the Institute was formed. And if you go, the slide that talks about 17 years that there was research into practice gap, it has really bothered me that once I read that from the Institute of Medicine report, I was like, oh my gosh, 17 years before new knowledge is generated, translated into action is really way too long. So that is one of the reasons why we formed the Institute for Perinatal Quality Improvement, because we know that QI saves lives. The mission of the Institute for Perinatal Quality Improvement is to expand the use of improvement science in order to eliminate preventable perinatal morbidity, mortality, and end perinatal racial and ethnic disparities. We know that's a very audacious goal, but we know also that it's possible. Many of these deaths are preventable, and with us working together, we would be able to make a big difference. We also, the vision statement for the Institute for Perinatal Quality Improvement is that we'll work to ensure that all perinatal clinicians utilize improvement science methods in their work. And we know that the way in which to get the use of improvement science is there's a lot of education that is needed by the clinicians. And I want to thank the members of our Executive Advisory Board. If you can, I think the slides are catching up with me shortly, so you should see shortly the names of the current members of the Executive Advisory Board who have been helping pull this whole organization together, very well-known and respected leaders. It's an interdisciplinary Executive Advisory Board with doctors and nurses from different parts of the country. We also have a very excellent and editorial advisory board, and want to thank them as well, and they're pictured in that slide. We I don't know if any of you have saw that the Hastings Center put together a report on ethics and the ethics of QI. And I think it's important to point out that QI was identified by the Hastings Center, which is the major think tank in the United States, stated that QI is not purely discretionary, that health professionals, managers, delivery organizations, and even patients and government all have an ethical responsibility to improve care and to cooperate with each other. So today's topic is particularly important given the fact that Miranda, although she's speaking from the perspective of a patient, she also is very much engaged in QI, that this isn't something that only clinicians are involved in. We also know, though, that perinatal clinicians need QI education and QI support, and know that a lot of us didn't get this education in school before graduating, learning about QI methods and concepts, about theories, frameworks, process models, ethics, QI tools. All of these are very important concepts and information to help us do the job of QI more effectively. So that's one of the things that the Institute for Perinatal Quality Improvement is working on. We have identified 4 challenges and several solutions to fit with these 4 challenges. The first challenge is that we're working to support you all on is to enhance collaboration and learning from among perinatal QI leaders. And we're doing that by having, we've developed what's called the PQI project map. And with that, we want you to be able to collaborate with each other by pinning your projects on the map. And here's an example of what the map kind of looks like at this point. And we're hoping that more of you start pinning projects on the map to be able to share with each other more effectively what you're working on and what you're learning through your QI project. Because I think waiting for all of these projects to get published in the journals and all of that, it just takes a long time. So we're trying to think about ways to share this information more real time, more quickly. Challenge number 2 is helping keep staff engaged in QI projects. And so one of the solutions we've come up with this is we've launched QI action briefs. So these are perinatal quality improvement action briefs. The first one was launched in November of 2017, and it was focused on postpartum hemorrhage. What the action briefs include case studies and guidance for identifying and setting priorities, some education on postpartum hemorrhage, education on quality improvement concepts, methods, and tools. It includes facilitator notes and then action plan templates, so how you can take the case and then learn from it and then make adjustments at your own facility. Action Brief 2.1 will be released on May 30th. We hope you sign up in order to receive this action brief, and it's on neonatal resuscitation. So the 2 action briefs a year that we are releasing, the fall action brief is a maternal action brief. The spring action brief will be a neonatal topic action brief. The benefit of these action briefs is that they already have the slides developed. The cases are then selected that could have happened anywhere and have happened in multiple places. And we think that by having this case-based approach in, using these action briefs will be a great way of learning. When I was the director of nursing, I know how sensitive people were when something bad happened, and it was hard to talk about it because everybody, you didn't want to add to people's distress. But having a case that is a case that we could all learn from, where it's easier to point out all the things that went wrong and all of the things that people can learn from the case, will help us to talk through cases, actual cases in our facilities, as well as just learning from these cases. And they are a way to help get the lessons from our maternal morbidity and perinatal morbidity and mortality reviews out there more effectively. The third challenge is that clinicians are struggling to learn about and try to keep up to date on QI concepts, methods, tools that really work. And so we post blogs regularly. We actually just went live today with a new blog, which is Miranda's story. But this is the previous blog where I outlined implementation science as the physiology of quality improvement and go through some of the concepts around implementation science, which is a relatively new science. The Journal of Implementation Science is only 11 years old, so it's hard for us to keep up on the clinical topics, let alone the implementation science. So that's what we're trying to help do at the Institute for Perinatal Quality Improvement, help you keep up to date on implementation science, improvement science methods. Challenge number 4 is perinatal clinicians need to learn how to lead QI efforts. And the solution we've come up with there is to implement Perinatal Quality Improvement Conference. We held our first conference at the NYU on February 1st, and we're also working with others to find locations where that may want to host that conference. So many of you I know on the call have probably already signed up to join us in our efforts to eliminate preventable perinatal morbidity and mortality. We hope those who haven't signed up yet will do so and help support our efforts to expand the use of quality improvement in the United States and in the world. And now, without further ado, I'm going to now introduce Miranda Klassen, the speaker for today. She is just a dynamic individual and just done such amazing work and helping help us learn more about amniotic fluid embolism and working to save women's lives from those women from an amniotic fluid embolism. She's going to give us an update on research and resources that are available. And Miranda also, as we mentioned before, has, did suffer from an AFE. And then subsequent to that, and she survived, which is not that common. Unfortunately, we want to change that. But she also then went on to take that experience and then become the executive director and form the AFE Foundation. So she's going to tell more about her story, and without further ado, I'm going to turn the time over to Miranda.
Thank you, Deborah. Hopefully everyone can hear me as well, since Deborah and I are not in the same location. I am joining all of you from sunny San Diego. I know many of you, maybe on the East Coast, aren't feeling the love of spring yet, but rest assured it's 80 degrees here. So let's go ahead and get started. So as Deborah shared, I just want to go ahead and share with everyone, I am not a clinician. I am an AFE survivor. I actually had my AFE 10 years ago during the birth of my son, and I'll get more into my story later as we go. But just keep that in mind that I am not actually a clinician. Let's get started. I have no relevant financial relationships to disclose. So today, the learning objectives, which all of you should have received, really are to become better acquainted with AFE. Let's talk about the current research and the available opportunities for all of you to help participate and help us look for, identify ways that we can hopefully prevent this or certainly help increase the survivor rate. And then we'll talk about current available resources that you can use to help you improve not only care for your patients and their families, but you as well. And so we'll get into those here in just a bit. I'm sure by now all of you have heard about AFE is the medical equivalent of being struck by lightning. I actually think, I don't know if it's just the sheer terror of it or the unpredictability that made this kind of a common allegory, but I think we've actually done a better job at understanding lightning than we have and ways to avoid it than we have with AFE. So let's get into the common misunderstandings. These are kind of like the top 5 myths, and they're not necessarily myths per se, as at one point these weren't wrong, but these have perpetuated over time. Really, it's a result of not staying up to date on the current research, but let's dive into this. The first one is that AFE occurs 1 in 100,000 deliveries. I'm going to explain and dispute all of these in our presentation. The other one is that autopsy is the only way to diagnose AFE. Many times we hear from patients and even clinicians is well, you couldn't have had an AFE because you're still here, and the autopsy is the only way we're able to diagnose it. Another common misunderstanding is that fetal squames found in the vasculature, which can either be done at autopsy or with bronchoscopy, would confirm an amniotic fluid embolism. Also, induction medications and their role in causation of AFE. And then lastly, women who survive AFE should not go on to have more children. And I'm sure that there's probably a catch of breath on the phone. All of you are muted, but I'm sure many of you who've ever experienced a patient who's hopefully survived an AFE, and maybe one of those questions is can I have more children? Most often survivors will respond that their clinicians, even their doctors, told them that it's not a wise idea. So let's get into the basics. I'm going to spend some time just kind of covering the basics about AFE, and then we'll get into the research and the resources. What is AFE? We know that it's incredibly complex in terms of we don't know its etiology. So yes, it's complex when we talk about DIC. Yes, it's complex when we talk about what's happening with the heart rhythm. But if we get back to the very simple classic triad of symptoms, this will help us as we move forward with some of the challenges that we've had if we get this basic understanding. So it should include three things. We should see hypoxia, followed by acute hypotension, oftentimes with pulmonary hypertension, and then followed by coagulopathy. Now, this can be fulminant or it can be delayed, not too delayed, somewhere within an hour we typically see for AFE with DIC. What's been talked about quite a bit recently is really the difference and the severity of AFE. Most often, the classic symptom or the classic presentation can be sudden. It's catastrophic. It's unmistakable. You have a woman who is laboring. She suddenly says she's having a hard time breathing. Suddenly, her eyes roll back in her head. She has a seizure and then goes asystole. That is oftentimes when you're going through your differential diagnosis. This is clearly a case of AFE once you reach through that differential diagnosis. But sometimes it can be actually less dramatic. And that's often seen during a cesarean delivery when the anesthesiologist is involved. They're up at the head of the bed. They're actually closely monitoring mild hypoxia or hypotension, especially with medications. And so what can happen in cases of cesarean deliveries is that everyone's there, everyone's monitoring, the patient's monitored quite well, and the anesthesiologist can somewhat recognize these symptoms and does interventions to help that. Unfortunately, it doesn't stop the incoming tide, and then suddenly your patient, goes asystole. And so that can be less dramatic. It's something that you wouldn't normally see in a laboring patient because those maneuvers done by the anesthesiologist have somewhat masked those early kind of warning signs. So I add this slide about the prodromal symptoms. I wish there was more clearly defined symptoms that would give you a heads up that an AFE is imminent. But I include these really because with our registry and the research we've done and the stories that we've heard with countless women is that in almost all there is documentation of these prodromal symptoms that I've listed, where it's an alteration of mental status, expressed anxiety or fear, an impending sense of doom, and sometimes agitation. Now, I know that these are somewhat benign symptoms and very common symptoms in labor and delivery, but I'll give you an example. When I was during my AFE, I went from being a very jovial, talkative individual who had labored through the night and was talking with the new, getting to know my oncoming nurse early that morning. And, we were talking about our history and our families, and then some interventions were done. And shortly after those interventions were done, I became much more anxious. And shortly before I had a seizure and collapsed, I had turned to my nurse and said, "Am I going to die?" And in her 30 years of practice, she had never heard anyone make that statement or ask that question. And it really spurred her. And then just a few moments later, I actually seized and suffered a cardiac arrest. Let's talk about incidence and mortality rate. This is somewhat of a challenge. It's been a challenge for as long as AFE has existed, and it's a bit controversial. And it really comes back to how catastrophic is the presentation. If we look at that classic triad that I shared with you that's accompanied with a cardiac arrest, we know that the mortality rate is closer to 80%. We know this even if we look at in-hospital records and data that anyone who suffers a cardiac arrest, regardless of the etiology of the arrest, we know that CPR and response is somewhat dismal. And then we also know that there is a formed thrust, a less severe presentation with AFE, and that mortality rate is significantly less, and we see that around 20%. But the other challenge that we have with this is how strictly you define AFE. If we look at administrative data, which is really coming from coding and things that we've seen here at our foundation, we have a high incidence in terms of how often and how common is AFE. We have a high incident rate of AFE, and we have a very low mortality rate. But if we were to take those records and we look at small case studies or small data sets where clinicians have actually reviewed the records and fully reviewed everything and sat down and used some algorithms, we see a much lower incident rate and a much higher mortality rate. Our organization likes to stick, and kind of going back to that first myth, which is 1 in 100,000. I mean, we've even heard it's 1 in a million. Really, the current estimate is 1 in 40,000 deliveries. That's what our organization uses. That's what our medical advisory board uses. And really, that's based upon several things. One, it's a review of some of the registries that our colleagues in other countries have, which are robust. And while there is a bit of a challenge, we've looked at those, and then we've correlated those to the birth rate here in the United States. So we believe AFE happens about 1 in every 40,000 deliveries. Now, if we look at risk factors, this is another highly disputed, highly discussed topic, which is who's at risk, and how, if we could identify who's at risk, how could we then prevent this? And so this is obviously something that's of great value and great importance. But here's an example. If we were to give you the scientific approach to this, we would share with you that there are no recognized risk factors with sufficient scientific validity to warrant any alteration in management of labor and delivery in order to avoid or reduce the risk of this condition. That's the politically correct version of this. The not politically correct version is there's no recognized risk factors. Now, we can talk about multiples, we can talk about IVF, we can certainly talk about induction. And what's really happened, and what's of interest to us as an organization and in research, is that an example is a Canadian study that was done in the late 90s that showed a correlation between induction and AFE. Unfortunately, about 10 years later, they weren't able to duplicate those same findings. And so it's very challenging for us to be able to put together risk factors that would be sufficient enough to change the method of management. Now, I always, again, because I'm not a clinician, I won't go into a great depth about treatment. But I will say this, Dr. Stephen Clark, who's one of the chairs of our medical advisory committee, really understands that this is a complex and very complicated situation. But he doesn't want to complicate it any further. And so he likes to go back to this very simple process, and kind of the ABC and then adding the D if we have a woman who has not yet been delivered. If your patient is hypoxic, we give them oxygen. If they are hypotensive, we support their blood pressure. If they become coagulopathic, we give product. And I think while this seems somewhat sophomoric or somewhat oversimplified, I do think that some of the challenge with AFE is that it is so complex, and because it is so unpredictable and it comes out of nowhere, that you start to think to yourselves as clinicians, oh my gosh, what do we do? And I think this is where Dr. Clark, who's an MFM, who trains MFMs all over the country on severe maternal events, really wanted to bring it back to very, very basic treatment. Now, I did list on here tranexamic acid and use of recombinant factor 7. Those are great products that can be used when treating an AFE. We know that tranexamic acid is having a great success in the postpartum hemorrhage. His recommendation is to use these sooner than later if you have access to them. And I also want to share with you some of the empirical interventions that have been reported in the literature, and I'll explain here in just a moment why some of these are a challenge. But some of their case reports are uses of LVAD, ECMO, nitrous, and TEG. I want to give caution in that many of those case reports are one single N, and oftentimes the case reports will give a great deal of credit to these interventions as having saved the patient's life. And while, yes, it may be true, it would have added to that, we don't necessarily know if these are specific to just AFE. A lot of these that are listed here are really things that we see in the intensive care setting. And the other thing that we give caution on is that the use of these case reports and the diagnostic criteria used when giving these case reports is, in some of these cases, if we were to dive in and look at them, they actually did not have an AFE. So there are two other empirical interventions that have gained some notoriety. The first may be new to some of you that you see on here. It is the 50-50-500 cocktail. It's something that was kind of thought about as the brainchild of Dr. Mike Foley, who's also critical care MFM, and Dr. Clark often teases that if Mike Foley likes it, then it's good. This is basically histamine blockers, and it's really trying to address what we believe is the SIRS-like reaction to the fetal contents, and that the mother is having this allergic or anaphylactoid-like reaction. This is what is being purported as helping that systemic issue. The other one is also something that the anesthesiologists can use in their arsenal, but I say this with a bit of caution. And this is the AOK method. This was has been around for quite some time. It was really promoted by Dr. Barbara Layton, a anesthesiologist who has since retired. And unfortunately, there is not a lot in the literature about this. Both of these therapies or cocktails, if you will, are going to be extremely challenging in a clinical research study because, again, every patient is different. There is a growing group of us that are really exploring this AOK methodology, and we hope that here in the very near future we will have more of a stance and be able to clearly articulate if we think this is a wise choice. But as always, the recommendation is that if you have these interventions available to you, by all means, if you find it necessary, by all means, they should be used. But under no circumstances are any of these proven that they will, in fact, increase survivability. So if we get back to what have we learned in nearly a century, let's just kind of go down, in order for us to get to the research and the resources update, I think it's important that we take kind of a step back and look at where we've come with AFE and how long this complication has really existed. In 1926, it was first recognized and reported in a Portuguese journal out of Brazil. And in 1941, two doctors defined AFE based on post-mortem findings of fetal squames in the vasculature. Now, obviously, back then, AFE had an incredibly high mortality rate because we don't have all the interventions and we didn't have access to, blood products and things of that nature. It was incredibly fatal. And so really all we had to go on was autopsy. In the 1980s, Dr. Clark, who I've shared with you already, started a registry and began to really look at diagnostic tools. He began to review cases and really started to disprove this theory that it was really based on fetal squames. In 1995, Dr. Clark proposed a new name, and as though AFE wasn't difficult enough for the layperson or for any of us, he just wanted to change it to anaphylactoid syndrome of pregnancy. And despite that that's probably much closer to describing the mechanism of what's happening, it was not widely adopted, and AFE has remained. One of the most prophetic and probably troubling historical references that I like to use, and I'll never forget where I was when I first heard this comment, but it is from Dr. Nicholson Eastman. Dr. Eastman was an MFM. He was the chair at Johns Hopkins, a former ACOG president, and he had this, he asked everyone to heed this warning, which is, let us be careful not to make the diagnosis of amniotic fluid embolism a wastebasket for cases of unexplained death during labor. He said this in 1948. What he said and what he warned us of still 70 years later holds true. The number one impediment to us progressing in better understanding AFE and being able to someday prevent AFE really boils down to diagnosis. As we know, AFE is a diagnosis of exclusion, and that makes it very challenging. But the previous theory of cause has what's perpetuated this diagnostic criteria, if you will, or has maybe skewed the diagnosis. So the diagnosis of fetal squames in the vasculature wasn't wrong. It's just been, now we understand that it's actually been disputed. So the previous theory of cause was that amniotic fluid was actually forced into the vasculature, and it created this cellular debris which obstructed the pulmonary arterial flow, which caused this hypoxia. But what it didn't do is it didn't really address the DIC and the activation of the clotting cascade. Let me go back to this. This is also, I just want to add, you know, this whole process was really what all of the literature was based on in the 1980s. And so this is a good reason as to why we continue to hear that it's a pulmonary obstruction, or we continue to hear that an AFE was confirmed in autopsy because there were fetal squames. With this same ideology, there came these proposed AFE markers. And so over the years, various reports have come, and I'll list these all. We don't need to read them all. But many of them were markers of the complement activation. We've looked at IGF-BP1. And while these may or may not be true, and in fact, one of the biggest issues that we have of this is why are these markers questionable in some of the science? Why they're questionable is that most of the studies use normal pregnant women, not critically ill pregnant women, as controls. And this is a challenge because the women and the markers they were looking at, they were very non-specific. And it really threw off the controls, and that's something that our research is going to be looking at very specifically, is how do we compare an ill woman, an AFE patient, with another ill patient, so that we don't have some of these, let me go back to this previous slide, some of these proposed AFE markers, which are really markers in anyone who is critically ill. The new proposed mechanism was proposed by Dr. Clark and a team of maternal fetal medicine specialists, which was really what they believe is this is more of an anaphylactoid-like reaction. It's really mimics SIRS. Dr. Clark went to several immunologists. He asked several intensivists in the critical care setting, when would you have a woman who would, or an otherwise healthy patient, suddenly become, into full hypoxic and suffer cardiac arrest and then have this clotting cascade happen? And the response was, has to be a bolus of infectious material. That would be the only other mechanism that we would see this in. And so the new proposed mechanism is that it's a disruption of the maternal-fetal barrier during delivery, where this fetal antigens or infectious tissue enters into the circulatory system, and this activation of pro-inflammatory mediators begins. And I will just take a sideline right here at this box and just say that Dr. Roberto Romero at the NIH also had a recent paper a few years back where he looking at inflammatory response, and he had two women who had come in asymptomatic into the hospital, suffered an amniotic fluid embolism, and was able to go back retrospectively and look at their specimens at entry when they came into labor and delivery before event. And what he found was actually rather surprising, which was that there were incredibly high levels of tumor necrosis factor, and clearly showing that there was an inflammatory response happening even before the women became symptomatic. So getting back to this proposed mechanism, the fluid comes into the system, could be a small amount, large amount, comes in the system, it sets off this inflammatory response and a SIRS-like activity, where we have now the pulmonary hypertension, uterine hypertonic, and now we come into this hypoxia, myocardial depression, and then the pulmonary and central nervous system are activated. And at the same time, as though that wasn't enough, this SIRS-like response also activates the coagulation cascade, and that's when you enter into this troublesome DIC. Well, this is hot off the press, and we're kind of getting into the latest research, which is I'm very excited to share with you. This is actually just published this month in the Green Journal, and this is Dr. Clark's kind of brainchild that he's had for the last 30 years. So as he saw in the 80s, he was really starting to see the pulmonary, the squames in the pulmonary vasculature and it being obstruction. He really wanted to dispute that. And it took several years for him to get to a place where he could have a lab and he could do this study. And basically what they did was they did a hemocytometric cell count. They took 30-term amniotic fluid specimens. And what they did was they took these into the lab and they looked at the specimens and they determined the mean squame count in 1 milliliter of amniotic fluid. And what they came up with was this count of how many fetal squames were in there. And then they looked and they studied and worked with several other clinicians, and they looked at see how many alveolar units were in the pulmonary structure and the pulmonary capillaries. And they found that there were 480 million alveolar units. And then they went back and basically said, okay, well, if we bolus an entire liter, the entire amount of amniotic fluid into the vasculature, would we have pulmonary obstruction? Would one of these fetal squames be able to find one of these capillaries and one of these alveolar units and clog up the whole system? And what he found was, even with an infusion, which usually it's a very small amount, but even if we infuse an entire liter of amniotic fluid, it would only impact 0.1% of the alveolar unit. So therefore, it is completely disproving that AFE does not involve pulmonary obstruction in the vasculature. So if we go back and we say, okay, well, if we don't have pulmonary squames and or squames in the pulmonary vasculature, and we can't look at these proposed markers, how about we just use a clinical diagnosis? And again, it goes back to this challenge of it being a diagnosis of exclusion, which unfortunately has been rather vague over the years. So I want to take a look at what the data shows us about when you use a diagnostic criteria of exclusion. If we look at the administrative data sets that we've seen, about 1/3 of the cases coded as AFE submitted to national registries had a clearly different condition than when the medical records were examined by a critical care MSM. And this holds true to what we've seen in our AFE registry, is that roughly 30% of the women in our registry and 30% of the survivors actually very likely suffered a hemorrhagic shock, a postpartum hemorrhage that unfortunately was not well managed. And yet, even with this administrative data, and even when we can say we've got all these experts and we're able to look at abstract all the data, even that has some degree of subjectivity. And I've seen that personally where we sit around a table and we're looking at final diagnosis and I hear the doctor speaking. There's a great degree of subjectivity, and sometimes we simply don't know what happened to the patient. But here is a list of very common what we've seen in the registry and what we've seen reported when we've looked at admin data sets and then abstracted the data. These are really the top 5 erroneous diagnoses that are often given a diagnosis of AFE when it was clearly something that could have been out. So it was hemorrhagic shock or postpartum hemorrhage, an anesthetic accident, sepsis, a PE, or an anaphylactic anaphylaxis. Now, if we were to look in literature and we were to look at case studies and case reports, you would always see something like this. All patients met American Diabetes Association diagnostic criteria for type 1 diabetes. Or we would see with all women included in the study met the standard ACOG criteria for preeclampsia with severe features. What we've been lacking in AFE research and papers is this uniformity of being able to say that the women in this study were clearly reviewed and they met the criteria, which really then led to us exploring, well, what is the criteria that people are using? We looked at other countries as well, since they have very large data sets. And what we found was, and I can share this slide if anyone's interested, because I do have a different slide, which really lists all the different countries. But if we looked at Japan, Australia, China, Canada, the UK, we found that they were inconsistent They are very nonspecific. They also were subjective, and they also many of them still relied on the fetal squame detection alone. So if we know that existing admin data sets and all the case reports have very little value in understanding this condition, yet this is really all we have. In the United States, we do not have a surveillance system. We do not have mandatory reporting. And so we know that really the future of AFE research has to come from these types of data sets, which is why we at the organization created the Amniotic Fluid Embolism Patient Registry so that we could voluntarily get access to records and really start to review these. But what we did was we knew we had to start over. We couldn't look at these international organizations. We knew if we were going to have a registry and we were going to determine whether or not these women had a case of AFE, we really needed to clearly define it so that anyone who was working within the registry, it didn't have to necessarily be MFM saying yes or no. So here is the Uniform Diagnostic Criteria for research reporting of AFE. This was approved through SMFM, and it was published in the Gray Journal, and something that we are actively trying to promote and have everyone implement, and we are actively trying to get the buy-in from other countries and other registries. And so I will go through this here just briefly, and I will point you to that in our references if you want to read more. But basically what we did was we really wanted to create, again, kind of going back to, let me just go back to the first couple slides when we were talking about these form FRUST or atypical cases. I always use this example. If we wanted to study the color red, and we sat down and we were all determining this, and then everybody said, well, what about maroon, or what about pink? Do we add those in? What about orange? Orange is a bit red. We would really dilute the pool if we were really trying to just study what the classic form of red was. And that's the same thing with AFE, is that we haven't had this very clean data set. And so we understand that through this, we actually may unfortunately limit some people from having that clear diagnosis. It doesn't go back into how we treat a patient, but this really is going to help us with the research and better understanding the condition, is to get the most classic cases of AFE, because once we have that classic and very clean data, then we can reach and we can go into the outskirts and we can try and figure out maybe these women do have a less severe AFE, or maybe these women actually have something altogether different. So we look at the sudden, so here's the criteria. This is the algorithm. A sudden onset of cardiorespiratory arrest, or both hypotension and respiratory compromise, or cyanosis. Overt DIC following these initial signs and symptoms, using somewhat of a modified scale from the International Society of Thrombosis and Hemostasis, because they have their own scoring mechanism, but we use a modified version of that. And so we use this modified scoring system prior to sufficient blood loss to account for dilutional coagulopathy. That's going to throw out our postpartum hemorrhages. Next was the clinical onset of during labor, or within 30 minutes of placental delivery. And I'll be honest with you, many of the team really wanted to keep it at 10 minutes of clinical onset of labor. We kept it at 30. That's a little bit more of a cushion. But really, again, this is going to help us really dismiss any cases of postpartum hemorrhage. And then no fever during labor, and that will help us eliminate any of the septic shock patients. Here, just a little bit further, what this is the modified DIC criteria. And really what this does is a scoring mechanism. And this will help determine whether or not your patient was truly in full DIC. So basically, we looked at this and we said, does this work? If we come up with this criteria, does this actually work? So we have 115 cases at the time when we looked at this. And we submitted these cases. These cases were submitted to the registry. All the cases were reviewed by 3 MFMs, and they were up for this subjective evaluation. The MFMs did not use this criteria. They sat down, they went through the research, they went through the abstracted cases and came up with it. They were all so they were reviewed by the MD research fellow who had, I'm sorry, I was just thinking of his name. His name was Amir. He was wonderful. Amir had no OB experience. He was a doctor, and he was helping us out. and had no OB experience. And he basically went in and he saw, did they meet the strict new diagnostic criteria that we had proposed? Every case, of all the cases, 54 met the strict criteria, were also determined to have had an AFE by the experts. 14 of the cases that were determined to have a probable AFE by the experts did not necessarily meet that criteria. So again, if we look at these two numbers, the 54 would be that very classic AFE, and the 14 would probably be that more form-thrust AFE. So with this new diagnostic criteria, we have a 100% positive predictive value. We have a 78% sensitivity. It will allow us to get clean data for the sake of science, even when it's submitted by non-experts. And while it's important to remember the imperfect sensitivity when dealing with clinical practice and quality review, this really means that if you are on a review board or if you're in practice, this doesn't necessarily mean that your patient didn't have an AFE or you would change the course of treatment or what you would tell the patient. This is really just specifically for publishing research. So now that we have the ability to obtain a clean data set, then how will we identify those markers? So if we go back, when we talked about the markers that were being reviewed, the data wasn't clean. So here is what we are currently doing, and this is where we can use your help. We have a prospective specimen collection where we are collecting the remaining blood, ideally in a red, purple, or green top, and have it timed. We are also trying to collect cord blood or a piece of the placenta, and we ask that those specimens would be stored securely in the lab, and then we ask that you contact the AFE Foundation to work on consenting the patient. So basically, this is a prospective specimen collection where if you have a patient who suffers an amniotic fluid embolism, we ask that you please contact us, and so that we can help you consent the patient if it's appropriate. We will not take any specimens we won't take any new specimens. All of these specimens are sitting in the lab and would normally be discarded. Let me just get to this next slide. So here are some of the markers that we're looking at. The inflammatory mediators, which I had mentioned before with the TNF alpha. We're looking at doing a genetic comparison or looking at HLA types between mom and baby, and even looking at extended family members, especially for women who had an AFE on their second, third, or in some cases 12th child, where they had no previous other complications. So we want to know what's different in that baby's DNA versus another sibling's DNA. We also let you know that we are always welcome to collaboration or ideas if there's something and this is an area that you are interested in. We know that this is not going to be just us. This is going to be a multidisciplinary, a multi-university, multi-organization approach to this. So again, just kind of reiterating how we work together, you would contact the AFE Foundation within 5 days of an AFE. There's no HIPAA violation. We don't ask for any identifying patient information. We are extremely sensitive to the situation. We work together as a team. We'll work with you. We work with the OB or the midwife. We'll work with the intensivist in the ICU. We'll work with social workers if it's a case where we did not have a positive outcome. We use already drawn or discarded specimens. So basically, we contact the lab right away, or you can contact the lab and say, we've had this patient with this rare event. Clearly, the lab is going to know. They're already going to be aware of this patient. And just simply ask them to hold those specimens off to the side and not discard them in the usual 7-day or post-discharge fashion. We assist with all the specimen preparation and all the shipments. There is no cost to the hospital, no cost to the patient. We take care of everything. So let's get into some of the resources that are available to you now that we've covered some of the research. And, my 20 years before I started this endeavor, I was in sales, and I always knew that you should always do something for someone before you ever ask for anything. So I apologize that I've just asked you to participate and help in our research, and I haven't given you. So here is what I offer to all of you, and This might be a review for some of you, but for some of you on the call, hopefully not, and you'll learn some new resources. I want to direct your attention to the Council on Patient Safety and Women's Healthcare. This is the board that I am incredibly grateful and humbled to be a part of. It's a multidisciplinary team based at ACOG, where we have representation from A1, ACNM, SOAP, ASA, MFMs, ACOG, family practitioners, you name it, we've got constituents, and there's also patient advocates. I'm very fortunate to be one of those patient advocates on this board, and one of the projects that I was able to participate in was these toolkits and bundle development. And what I found in doing the foundation for the last 10 years was severe maternal events are not only life-changing for the patient's family, but they're life-changing for the care team as well. I really felt like we needed to address some of those issues. And so this, I'm going to direct you, it would take a full 2-hour webinar to go over everything that's in this bundle because it's so robust. So I give you a screenshot of the website, which is, I list here, safehealthcareforeverywoman.org. And I would really draw your attention to this support after severe maternal event. And the reason why I say draw your attention to it now is don't wait till you have a severe maternal event. Look at it and be ready and be aware of some of the resources that are available to you. One of the greatest attributes that I think that this bundle offers is a summary, a clinical summary after a severe maternal event. It's basically a discharge form that you can give to your patient. So this isn't only just for AFE, this is for any severe maternal event. It's a discharge summary that you can give to the patient so that she has a better idea and better understanding of what happened. How many units of product did she receive? Did she have a second-degree laceration or tear? Did she have an episiotomy? Did she have an unexpected C-section? What medications were given? Did she have a uterine artery embolization? All of those interventions, believe it or not, us patients sometimes forget, we don't understand, and then especially for our military folks who, or people who move, the continuity of care is very challenging for anyone with a severe maternal event. But also some of the other nuggets that are in this are how to reduce second victimization for all of you who experience a severe maternal event. I can say wholeheartely that I know that it affects everyone. We've had clinicians leave their practice because of what they've witnessed. So I know a lot of people in medicine talk about burnout, but this is something that's very important, which is your emotional well-being as well. So that's why I give a great emphasis on this council and this particular bundle. It's now an AIM bundle, which I think shows the value of it. Next is just a little plug about our organization. We are a unique coalition. We have a coalition where affected families, we've got phenomenal and respected clinicians, we have world-renowned researchers, we have all of you who are engaged advocates who are interested in learning and supporting our cause, really working together to do 3 key initiatives. One is advance research, promote awareness and education, which is what we're doing today, and really offering support to the families. You know, we leave your loving arms and of all of you who care for us, and then we sort of go home and kind of get sent to the wolves. So I always say that we are sort of the safety net for your AFE patients. Here are some of just the examples of what we do to promote education. We're very active in A1, SMFM, ACOG, ACOOG, and SOGH. We hold executive board positions with CMQCC, the Council for Patient Safety, and I'm very happy to say that I'm with the Institute for Perinatal Quality Improvement. We do various lectures at clinical meetings, and we've been able to be a co-author and presenter of some of these bundles. And I'm also a member of the Maternal Cardiac Arrest Simulation Work Group, which is a huge project being undertaken, and we're waiting for the grant. And I think that's going to be some wonderful, wonderful help for anyone who has a pregnant mother who suffers a cardiac arrest. I shared many of the things with you about advancing our research. We have our Amniotic Fluid Embolism Registry. Here's a picture of our team. We have the largest database in the world of AFE cases. It's going to be the basis for our clinical research. We have collaborations and Prospective, the Prospective study I'm telling you, with the NIH as well. And we've published many papers and abstracts on the diagnostic criteria, management, and reproductive outcomes for women. I did want to share with you something that I'm profoundly proud of, which is this recent abstract, soon-to-be paper, which is the risk of amniotic fluid embolism recurrence and subsequent pregnancy. And really, I can send you, but it will be in the resources. But really, what we concluded was we have the largest group of women that we've been following. At this particular time, we only had 6 patients that we were able to follow, but bringing the total up to 16 women who have had an AFE that have gone on to have a subsequent pregnancy or pregnancies without incident. So while the N is little, I think there's great hope in this, and I think that this again proves that it's specifically to that pregnancy or those fetal antigens or infectious material that's causing this catastrophic complication. I love this quote by Dr. Clark. The AFE registry is the most promising opportunity in better exploring this condition and developing a means of prevention and treatment. You know, Dr. Clark said this, he didn't say this to me personally, but he had written about it, and then I read it, and I was very touched by it because having Dr. Clark's support has been tremendous in our ability to really move the needle on this condition. What do we do for support? We have a crisis line, and it's 307-END-AFE. Any of you can call. This is the number you should call should you have a case. We are the only organization in the world dedicated specifically to AFE. We represent 500 and growing families all over the world. We offer outcome-specific guides and resources, and we do offer a clinician support group as well. We have about 15 support groups on Facebook for all the different, whether it's a woman who lost her baby during AFE, women who want to go and have another child, clinicians. We have one specifically for the widowers, one for grieving families, one for those dealing with brain injury, and one for survivors. Here's the next little plug. If you would like, you can, this is the time when you can text. If you can text the initials AFE to 444-999, and you'll be prompted, and you can sign up for, that we will not spam you, we will not ask for donations. This is specifically a clinician's list where we will send you our abstracts and research as it becomes available. So in conclusion for today is really, I hope that what we've been able to show is, or just touch upon, is that the understanding of current theories of cause is imperative to better understanding AFE and helping us prevent it. AFE statistics vary depending on the type of data set that was used. Misdiagnosis has a lasting impact on patient, not only on the patient, but also on research. Again, there are no confirmed risk factors. Pulmonary obstruction is not involved in AFE. There is currently no recurrence of AFE in any subsequent pregnancies in any of the literature or any that we have seen. And we have a very long list of AFE survivors who've gone on to become pregnant. We just don't have them all in the registry yet. And really the most promising opportunity for discovery is through this patient registry. And then, as Deborah mentioned on the blog post, is my story. I often do not talk about my story, but I'm going to take just one brief moment to share with all of you something that I think just lined up rather profoundly, and that is some of you are on the East Coast, so it's more timely. It's not on the West Coast at the time, but exactly 10 years ago today, I actually awoke from my coma and awoke to learn that my son had been delivered, and I had first heard the words amniotic fluid embolism. They didn't make any sense to me. I had no idea what it was. I remember waking and finding my best friend in the corner of the room who did not live in my state, and I knew by the looks on the faces of everyone in the room that whatever I had just gone through was incredibly serious. I will say that it's been a rough haul over 10 years from continuity of care and health and PTSD and starting this organization, but I knew at that day my life had changed. I became a mother, and I suddenly became aware of what this AFE condition was. So I thank you for being with me today. It is incredibly full circle. I will also share that my husband was very moved by the care that we received in the hospital, and he's here in this picture. He actually left his career in construction and went back to school. He'd already had a degree in biology and chemistry, but went back to school and became a critical care nurse. He's now a CCRN and a charge nurse in the same ICU where I recovered, and today he is charge, and today they just went live on Epic. So it really is very full circle, and I thank all of you for your time, your attention, and your desire to help us. And please know, if there's ever a doubt about the difference you make in the care of your patients, it really does make a difference. I am living proof of that. So here are the references for some of the statistics I offered for all of you today, and any of you can reach out to me directly at miranda@afesupport.org or through our website, and I'd be happy to share more research or more articles with you. And now I know we're right at time. I will switch over to see, text information. Let me go back. Here is the text information. And I'll just open it up to questions for as long as anyone can stay on the line with us. And I just, again, thank you for this incredible opportunity. Thank you, Deborah, and thank you to everyone who's in QI efforts. This country the needle is moving, and despite all of the news about maternal mortality, I believe that we are making a difference, and we're going to see that. I know we've seen it in California. So I encourage all of you to check out those resources and stay the course.
Thank you so much, Miranda. Your presentation was very informative, as well as it's really such a pleasure to know you and all of the work that you're doing to help all of us do a better job as clinicians, as well as help support women and families through these catastrophic events. If there are any questions, Miranda said she would be willing to stay. We're cognizant of everyone's time, so if you need to jump off the call, that's fine. We'll stay for about 5 more minutes, and you can put your questions into text, into the chat section of the webinar. One of the other things is, again, go and read her story on the PQI blog at the perinatalqi.org website. You can find the blog on the menu bar. You can also, we will also be sharing some of these resources as well, and the link to her organization through our website. So,
Deborah, do we want to open it up and unmute in case people had questions, or we're asking if these slides are available? Yes, the slides are available. Deborah, how do we want to do that? Do you want to make the slide deck available on your website, or do you want me to email them through?
We'll email that. We'll email out a link to everyone to the web page. We've also recorded this session, so you'll be able to have the slides as well as the recording. So if you wanted to have others be able to go through this recording, then that's also available for anyone who would like that. I'm hesitant to open up for actual verbal questions because sometimes people have a lot of background noise, so it's hard to hear. So I think if you just chat in your questions, that's the easiest way to do that.
And if you don't know how to do it, it's the bubble up at the very top. It's the chat bubble. If you click on that, it will open up a window for you where you can either put at Miranda and send it directly to me, or I think just sending it to all would be great. And then also, if you still are on the phone, I'm always interested in feedback, good or bad. It really helps us be able to give you the information, or if there's a topic that you want addressed. We are building out a clinician website. There will be access to links to all the papers. We are currently in the process of drafting an AFE checklist and an algorithm and some new management documents to make it easier for everyone that can be in your ORs that you can pull and have access to those resources. So.
Well, so Miranda, it looks like we don't have any questions at this time, and thank you for such a comprehensive presentation. Thank you, everyone, for all of your attention and for joining us at the Institute for Perinatal Quality Improvement. And we look forward to more interactions and more webinars are coming, and so stay tuned for the future webinars. And so with that, we'll go ahead and close out this session. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.